Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome and thank you so much for coming to today's broadcast. I hope everyone's doing well. Today, Jardin from Ukuvuma is presenting Optimus XPages, an explosion of techniques and best practices. My name is Courtney. I'm the marketing manager at Team Studio. Howard Greenberg and Paul Delanebbia from TLCC are joining me today, and we're your hosts. I'll be taking a few moments right now to cover some housekeeping items. Then I'll pass the presentation to Howard so he can give an intro, and then we'll dive into today's topic. So the housekeeping items. The attendee list is private. All attendees are muted during this session, so you can participate by typing your questions for John inside the questions section on your GoToWebinar window. We're doing Q&A at the end of the session, but you're welcome to ask your question at any point in the questions section. Howard and Paul will put a voice to it once John is finished presenting. This session is being recorded, and the links for the recording and the slides will be sent to you in a follow-up email in a few days. As most of you know, Team Studio provides notes application development tools and services. We celebrated 20 years in business at IBM Connect in Orlando last month. The Notes tools are our suite of tools for notes developers and admins. They help with tasks such as source code control, performance, and troubleshooting. We recently released Team Studio Usage Auditor, our IBM Notes application usage auditing tool. It captures business usage history across your entire IBM Notes environment, identifies user activity by filtering out server replication and agent activity, and audits apps for web browser and Notes client activity. For more info on this tool, visit Team Studio's website. Now I'd like to introduce IBM champion Howard Greenberg from TLCC. Howard's going to give an intro, then we'll get started with John's presentation. Over to you, Howard. I'll pass presentation rights now.
Okay, well, thank you, Courtney, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Myself, along with my partner at TLCC, Paul Delanebbia, will be your host today. Say hello, Paul.
Hello, everyone. Good day. Thanks for joining us.
And today we have all the way from South Africa, John Jardin. Before we get into John's presentation, a little bit about TLCC. Most of you are probably familiar with us since we've been around since 1997. We've been doing self-paced distance learning courses on Notes and Domino, various topics, XPages, of course, as well as Notes development and also administration courses. We have a pretty wide curriculum of XPages courses. We have 2 Java courses, the first course being kind of a basic introduction to the Java language. And the second course gets into a lot of advanced topics that people have been talking about on the webinars, such as creating and using managed beans and working with third-party libraries to create PDF files and spreadsheets, creating a sales order entry system and things like that. So it's definitely a very highly recommended course for people who want to dive more into XPages and kind of move beyond the server-side JavaScript types of things. We also have an XPages 2 course, which also has a lot of advanced topics, such as working with custom controls and Dojo data grids and XAgents and working with relational backend databases. And another course I wanted to highlight is a course that kind of has a funny name because we call it Rapid Application Development. And the reason we call it that is because it goes through a lot of the controls like navigators and the application layout control and things like that that you can use to build a good-looking application very quickly above and beyond the standard core controls in XPages. And of course, our best-selling course is our free demo course. So if you're on this webinar and haven't done anything with XPages yet, we invite you to go to the TLCC website and sign up for that. It's totally free. It's about a 3-hour course. Another service that TLCC offers is application development services. Paula and I have been doing a lot of work with our clients on applications. Most of them are Bootstrap enabled and have a lot of Java content in them. We've worked on projects that have converted Notes apps to mobile and web use. We've taken some of the old Domino web apps that were written with a lot of inline HTML and Lotus script web query save agents and converted them to XPages to modernize them. And we've done a lot of work in interfacing with backend data systems. One of the things I think Paul and I bring that's kind of an exclusive is that since our background is not only development and technical skills, but also we have instructor skills, that as we go through a project, I think Paul and I are very well positioned to also enable skills transfer to you guys who, or to our clients, to their development teams, so they can learn as well and be able to pick up and take on from there. So a little bit back to the webinars. And by the way, if you have any questions about anything that TLCC offers, you can just contact Paul and myself. Getting back to the webinars, we do have some webinar planned in April with Paul Withers and Jesse Gallagher. They're going to talk about the Domino API. This is kind of a modern Java API for dealing with Domino backend objects. And we do have some webinars in the works that I'm not ready to announce yet for May and June, but I think you'll find those to be very exciting. And just if you get the TLCC newsletter, we'll be announcing those in the next week or two, hopefully. All our previous webinars are at the link you see on the screen. We've got webinars going back a couple of years, all on YouTube with slides and demo databases. So there's a lot of great knowledge up there. So during the presentation that John's going to do, we're going to have the ability to ask questions. You're going to ask the questions in the questions pane in the GoToWebinar interface. So I have a screenshot of what that looks like. This is where you'll ask your questions. Ask your questions as you might think of them, and we're going to answer your questions at the end of the webinar verbally. So we're not going to really answer the questions in the GoToWebinar interface, but we'll verbally ask John the question at the end of the webinar. So without further ado, let me introduce John Jardin. His session is Optimus XPages, which I happened to catch at Connect and thought it would be a great presentation to bring to our webinar series. So John, are you out there?
I am, Paul. Sorry, Howard. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. I'm going to make you the presenter.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Clicking on the wrong thing. Let me see. The presenter. Okay, John, you should be getting the request there.
Can I confirm that you can see my screen?
I can. You've got the Connect 2016 Optimus XPages title screen.
Okay, perfect. Thanks very much, Howard. And yes, also just thank you very much to TLCC and Team Studio for giving me this opportunity to present on this webinar. And also thank you to everyone attending today. I really thank you for your time, and I really do hope that I can make every moment count. That is not an IBM Connect pitch, that is straight from the heart. So, without further ado, let us start. So, for those who don't know me, my name is John Jardin. I am the Chief Technology Officer of Ukuvuma Solutions based in South Africa. We're a software consulting company. And I've been doing development and consulting for over 14 years now, and am proud to say that I've been involved in over 200 development projects to date. My core focuses include general web technologies, mobile development, Bluemix, and of course IBM Domino and XPages. And I'm also proud to say that I am an IBM champion 4 years running and working hard to make it number 5, so holding thumbs. Yeah, before I continue, I've been getting a lot of slack recently for using the same profile picture whether I'm at events or whether I'm doing presentations or slides. So I thought I'd take this opportunity and fix the problem once and for all and make exclusive to this webinar a not so well-known profile picture of myself. So there everyone goes. Do with it what you will. All right. So let's jump into the agenda. I'm first going to take a few moments and help explain and motivate the reason for this presentation and why I decided to cook the whole thing up. And then from there, we'll be moving into the nitty-gritty details of Optimus XPages, which is divided into three main areas, which is application architecture, user experience, and of course, optimization. I'll close off with a couple of resource references, and then we'll move on to Q&A. All right. So, overview. I want to start this off by a quote that really sticks with me, which is, a developer in today's world needs to look both ways before crossing a one-way street. And for those who don't really know what that means, what I'd like to do is jump to the next slide, and then we can come back to this and elaborate a little bit further. All right. So most developers are facing a slight reality that businesses are in some way moving to the cloud. Now, this might not be a direct movement. This might be a slow but sure migration where it will be a hybrid approach. Some of the data will remain on-premise, but in some way, business applications that used to be on-premise are starting to interface with cloud services or in some way exist in the cloud. And this, if it's not happening to any of you at this time, there's a good chance it's probably going to be happening in the near future. And what this means is that we as developers, we need to start understanding the scoping of applications, new applications especially. We need to start understanding what questions to ask now already, even though these services or features might not be put in place. And one of them is the fact that applications need to be cloud ready. Now, I get a lot of people laughing at me whenever I say that because they assume I mean put your application on a Domino server hosted in an internet service provider. So that's not what I mean. When I say cloud ready, I'm referring to the not so well-known details of what it means to be a cloud application. And a good example of that is what the XPages runtime team have been doing with XPages on Bluemix. And you'll notice one of the first things that you need to know in order to have your XPages application running on Bluemix is you've got to separate your data from your design, right? You've got to have your data exist in a separate NSF. And the reason for that is because Cloud Strategy has the runtime, which in this case is your XPages application or a Node.js application, exist independently from the data store, which is, again, your Notes database or a DB2 or MongoDB. And the reason for that is because cloud capability allows your runtime to scale automatically. That's just one of the examples. So what I mean by that is your application might get hit on Bluemix by 10,000 users out of nowhere because of some great sales pitch that occurred. And there are services on Bluemix that allow your XPages application to scale accordingly in order to meet that kind of demand. But if your data exists in the same environment as your actual XPages application, it's going to, guess what? It's going to duplicate the data. So it just doesn't make any sense. Now, that's just one example of what I mean by being cloud ready. There's obviously a number of other additional examples. One easy one is it has to be web enabled, right? You can't develop rich client applications and expect to host them in the cloud. That's just not going to work. So yes, it has to be sort of accessible either via a web browser or accessed via a very well-known means such as native mobile applications. So other things to consider are APIs. There need to be integration points into your application that allow secure reading and writing of data. Your application existing in the cloud is most definitely going to be communicating with other services, and there is a good chance that at some point your application is going to be regarded as a service on its own, and therefore there needs to be a means of communicating with your application. And I'm not talking via the Domino object model, but I'm talking via web APIs and web services. All right. So that's very important to consider when scoping an application today. Another good example is modular services. The ability to actually treat your application as individual independent modules that have a core purpose and focus only on providing features and data related to that purpose. So you can't have well, when I say you can't, it's not advised to have an application that meshes together timesheet, purchase order, and customer relationship capabilities. All right, they need to be modularized in some way, so that when it does come to integration points, like your APIs, that everything can be a service to everything else. It's a different mindset. I know a lot of people don't adopt that with their current development, but once you get your head around it, it really becomes seriously powerful. And you can start looking into things like microservices and a series of additional options that cloud platforms provide developers. Okay, so you've then got mobile strategy, and I say we are no exceptions. And I think, you know, any web-based application that gets developed today, whether it has to exist in some form, and it has to be friendly on a mobile device. All right, whether it's providing data to a native mobile application, or whether the mobile strategy is to have a responsive, friendly mobile version of your online XPages application, there has to be some sort of mobile strategy. Now, I understand that most development and most projects are divided into phases, and phase one definitely does not require an application to be mobile friendly as yet, so its only purpose is to be accessible via a desktop or laptop, which is fantastic. And I'm not saying you must now go and convince your client that mobile strategy is part of phase one. What I am saying is that the frameworks and tools that you use as part of phase one should already accommodate phase X, where mobile becomes a reality. So, for example, in XPages, as part of the XPages extension library, we have access to the Twitter Bootstrap framework, which is built into the library, and one need only enable it inside their application in order to take advantage of its features and capabilities. You don't need to, in phase one, now go and design and spend countless hours trying to make your application work on a mobile browser, but at least have the framework running so that when the time comes, you merely need to tweak and polish up your application where most of the capability is already there. And that is what I'm referring to by mobile strategy, and by looking ahead and understanding where your application will most likely exist in 1 to 2 years from now versus where it exists right now, which is most likely on-premise and hopefully as an XPages application via a browser. All right. And finally, an optimized user experience and application performance. All right. So I spoke about this at Connect as well, and I kind of told everyone, let's take an application that you've developed that's on-premise, that's accessed on the same network on a Domino server. And if you had to move that application to a remote server sitting at an ISP, I'm curious how that application would perform and what would be affected. Would the user experience be affected due to slow lag or continuous refreshing? Will performance in general be fast and quick enough to be used as a remote application? And these are the things also to consider, even though your phase one might only be an on-premise application, because I guarantee you the way things are moving, at some point your on-premise application will not be on-premise for much longer, and it will need to exist elsewhere. So these are just some of the things that I recommend thinking about when scoping new applications and deciding what to do with existing applications. And coming back to the quote that I had over here, a developer in today's world needs to look both ways before crossing a one-way street. I think that's the message that I wanted to give to everyone, is that even though you're developing for something now, you need to consider where it's going to go, and you need to look both ways and create an expectation now already, because yeah, times are changing. All right, so that's my vent for the day. We can now move on with the rest of the presentation. All right, so let's jump into application architecture. Before I do this though, us as Ukuvuma Solutions, we spent the better part of the last few years really trying to understand the best approach to rapid application development, and at the same time delivering a fantastic user experience and an optimized application in general that will most likely be accessed in far remote places. And I'm sure you can all appreciate that us here in South Africa do not run 100 meg lines, and therefore performance cuts home, for lack of a better term. And the rest of this presentation divides the solutions that we came up with and managed to implement as live production applications at many of our clients. And we're proud to say that while there are many forms of best practice with any kind of platform or application, we've at least found one that really makes great sense. And that's really what this presentation is about, is to share that knowledge with everyone, whether you agree with it or not. Either way, it works and it's doing a great job. And even with our terrible internet lines, it seems to be making a positive impact. So I truly believe there's something for everyone in the following slides. Okay. So the first part of application architecture is the whole idea behind a single page application. All right, one entry point into your application, one URL, and once you launch that URL, you pretty much do everything that you need to do without the URL changing, with the exception of maybe small things like hashtags. And what this means for an XPage developer is it's one XPage and multiple custom controls. Excuse me, sorry. So if we take a look at the single page application idea, because it's one URL, full page reloading is no longer required. Okay. Now what this means, more importantly, is that even though a lot of your requests and your CSS, JavaScript, and images are cached, most likely cached because you've accessed the URL before, there's still a number of services that are run the moment you launch that URL. And by not requiring to perform full page reloading, you can have, and I have it as a second bullet point, you can have actions trigger as little as one server request in order to perform all the necessary operations on your page. All right, so, and thanks to the power of XPages, we've got partial refreshing, which takes care of the various areas of your page to replace and update and do whatever with the content without needing to do a full page reloading. And I know from experience that there are many other platforms, I will not name names, where partial refreshing is not a built-in feature. And I think as XPages developers, we really need to appreciate that facility that has been given to us and obviously make full use of it. So I've also got over here another advantage is that request and response data can be measured in bytes. You don't have to, you have to be obviously very careful in terms of how much you reload on your page. It's useless if you have one div that surrounds the entire content of that web page and then you just keep on partially refreshing that div. I think we're missing the point if that's what you're doing. But what we need to do is rather focus on the minimum, the sort of smallest area of your page that needs to be submitted back to the server. And once you get that right, you will see that data to and from the server is in fact measured in bytes, which is great news for any remote cloud application. And finally, your core CSS and JS resources are only loaded once. Now, I know a lot of people frown on this because, yes, they might not want to load all the CSS and JS resources until they are in fact required. But I must say, out of all the projects that we've done, I've loaded a series of backend libraries that include reporting capabilities. And thanks to the resource aggregation features that are available in XPages, some of the heaviest designs that we've implemented, which includes like 7-8 forms with workflows with a series of images, come to about 500 kilobytes for that page. So I think what we need to do is just understand the technology well enough, and things like loading all the necessary CSS and JS resources is not necessarily a problem anymore. So yeah. If we go to the disadvantages of using a single page application, yes, there is a JavaScript dependency, and that is client-side JavaScript. You're going to be using jQuery or Dojo to manipulate a lot of the UI to, firstly, prevent unnecessary callbacks and refreshing of the page. When something can be done by jQuery, do it by jQuery. Don't go and perform a partial refresh only to submit and return HTML content when only a field value or a label needs to change. But there is, in fact, there's most definitely a JavaScript dependency, so it doesn't play well with progressive enhancement. Many designers frown when things don't play well with progressive enhancement. And obviously, any browser with JavaScript disabled is going to run into some issues trying to access the site. The second disadvantage is that optimization is essential. You need to really write your code in such a way that it performs the least bit of operation and affects the least bit part of your web page in order to maintain that seamless experience for the user. Because remember, the context of all of these is based on the assumption that your application is in fact a cloud application remotely and not sitting on-premise. I think if the scope of this was to design an on-premise application, there's not too much that I could sort of justify. Third one is knowledge of third-party UI libraries is a must. All right, there are a lot of JavaScript libraries out there that can make your life so much easier, and it is worth the investment to go and understand those libraries. And in these slides later on, I will give a few examples of some of the libraries that I'm using for some of the applications we're developing. And then finally, a disadvantage is a single entry point to an application makes navigating a bit more complex. So imagine trying to open up a certain document from a link in an email that one sends to the user. How do you now go and open up this document in a single page application? Well, you know, there are definitely a lot of great ways to do this, but it's not as easy as just saying, well, open up this X page and pass this parameter and there you go. You obviously will need to provide a little bit more logic to your backend, but nothing too crazy that makes it undoable or something that you need to study months for. All right. So yes, what I'll do now is I'm going to go to a demo quickly, and I'm just going to show off two applications that give you an example of what single page applications can look like. All right, so please excuse that. All right, there we are. So this is an application that one can capture location details, and we've got the view over here, and we've got many ways that one can present the data. And this is all standard stuff. I'm just using the built-in XPages extension library with the Twitter Bootstrap framework enabled. So if I had to click on one of these, you can see on the right-hand side the document appears, and it allows me to go and view information related to the document, and it also integrates with Google Maps so that I can see the GPS coordinates of that. If I want to edit this document, I can edit it on the right-hand side and go and change whatever I want to change. This is my postal address, and click on save, and everything is updated. There we go. This is my postal address. What's nice though is even though I'm in the same page, I can open up an existing document and go and create a new document where I can go and fill in some details and populate. I'm just going to put my brother's name in. I've got some masking over here. There we go. Not applicable, not applicable, and not applicable for now. And I can click on save, and there we go. We've got the new entry over there, and I can click onto that new entry, and it's already available on the right-hand side. All right, I can click close over there, and this is the user interface. So this is just an example, one example of a single-page application where the user doesn't navigate to any other URL. They do everything that they need to do within this one space. And I've just got a series of JavaScript running around and doing the necessary modifications to titles, etc., etc. So, and obviously the backend is in Java. And I think a few important things to note while I'm here is that I don't necessarily use document data sources. In fact, there's two designs that don't exist when we develop for XPages applications. And those designs are form designs. There's no form designs in our systems. And the other one is document data sources. We do not use those controls. We do use view controls, but everything gets managed via Java Beans. Even for those who don't know Java that well, the learning curve in order to use and make use and bind Java Beans to your documents is really not a steep learning curve, and it's worth the investment. Please, if you find it in your heart to learn a little bit of Java just so that you can take advantage of that feature and replace document data sources, I highly recommend it. All right, so we've got another example over here, and this is a simple task management system that allows users to go and capture tasks, test task 1, there you go, and that adds it to the list over here, and I can switch between these different smart lists, and I can also go and create my own folders, my folder 1, and I can go and create my folder 2, and what I'll do is I'll go to the inbox, grab this, and switch it to my folder 1, also make it overdue, and you can see everything just gets updated accordingly. And finally, I can just go to my task and say that I'm done with it. Now, this is another example of a sort of a user staying in one environment. And this, what's different between this and the previous example is that this is in fact an XPages portal consisting of multiple applications that get accessed from one interface. So this is not only a single page application for one application, this is a single page design for multiple applications, and that just get accessed via one URL, and everything is managed via the necessary server-side and client-side logic. All right. So coming back to the presentation. The next part of application architecture is the OpenNTF Domino API. Now, I won't steal Paul Withers and Jesse Gallagher's thunder, as their session, their webinar next month is on this, and I'll keep it to a bare minimum. All I can really say is that I do highly recommend it. We do use it for our production applications, and just some of the core features that it offers, because it really offers, it's a massive toolkit for server-side development, and really comes with some great gems as part of the Java API. But just off the bat, it extends the Domino object classes. So your notes document, your note sessions, your notes datetime objects, by using the OpenNTF Domino API, you essentially have an improved version of the Domino object model. And not just that, you also have additional methods and properties that are now available to you, properties and methods that you didn't have as part of the original Domino API. So it's really, just for that very reason, it's worth its salt. And it's quick to install and configure, and whether it's a new application or whether it's an existing XPages application, there's very little that you need to modify in order to incorporate the OpenNTF Domino API into your design. Just a quick story, when I did this with an existing application, I was a bit challenging, and I did it a week before it went into UAT, because I just, I wanted to see what happens, and it's XPages, of course it will work. But I remember installing and configuring and enabling the OpenNTF Domino API for one of my applications. I needed to add an entry to the XSP properties. That was probably the most difficult part. I didn't get that. Paul Withers helped me with that part. And once I had done that, I started going into my Java design elements and my classes, and I started replacing the library references to reference the OpenNTF Domino API. And when I did a build on the design, the funny thing happened. I started receiving errors all over the place. And when I opened up one of them, the strangest thing happened. My recycling of Domino objects was a problem as far as the Domino API is concerned, because no recycling is no longer required. So part of the whole upgrade process to use the OpenNTF Domino API was to remove all the lines of code that try to recycle my Domino objects. So I had a pretty good laugh about that. That's a good problem to have. But other than that, there was really nothing else that needed to be done, with the exception to maybe one or two changes in how I loop data and how I reference the session object. That was it. It's as easy as that. You can have the OpenNTF Domino API running in no time, and it works. All right. Finally, one of the features that we'll be discussing soon enough is multi-threaded processing, but I'll leave it for the next few slides and give you a little bit more of a hands-on example on that. Then, another approach that we took was going with a model view controller strategy. Now, XPages doesn't enforce model view controllers or that approach. You can pretty much design however you want to design. It doesn't really make a difference when it comes to XPages. It's very easy to design in 1,000 different ways. What we did was, thanks to many of our other platform developers with different technologies, we kind of grabbed the best approaches to model view controlling, and we manually incorporated that into XPages development. And thanks to Java, we were able to pull this off quite well. So for everyone, I'm hoping that everyone understands what model view controller is, and I'll brief on it, but I will make the assumption that for the most part it is understood. All right, so a model is essentially a form type, right? So you have a timesheet, and a timesheet form consists of these fields. You've got a names field, you've got a multi-value field, you've got a text field, you've got a number field, you've got a date field, and all these properties that make up that form timesheet is what we regard as a model. It is a template for your form. And we create this model as a Java class inside XPages. We define the field names as class properties. We use the constructor to set the default property values, and we of course generate getters and setters for each of the properties so that we can bind these model properties to XPages controls in the actual UI. All right, so that is essentially our model, and this is what you've seen. If you've seen any of the Java video tutorials on David Lee's Notes in 9 site, you'll see many examples of how binding of data is applied using managed beans, which is what I'm calling a model in this case, and how that replaces the need for a document data source. All right, this is a quick example of a Java model, and you can see on top that the form model that would be replaced with something like timesheet or purchase order. And here is our constructor, and you can see I'm running a private function called init model, and all that init model do is it takes the two variables, which is our header of the form and a string called param1, and it goes and sets default values for them. So that's what the constructor does, and then your getters and setters at the bottom so that we can bind XPages controls to this model. All right, but let's take a look at the view now. The view is what we would regard as an XPage or custom control design element. It should only contain HTML and XML tags wherever possible. Things like style sheets, styling of these designs, and logic like whether it be JavaScript or Lotus script. What am I saying? Lotus script, oh my goodness. JavaScript or Java needs to exist separately inside the relevant classes. So whether you're using server-side JavaScript or whether you're using Java classes like the idea is that your code does not exist inside the XPage unless it is code that is calling a function or evaluating a true or false statement. And that is how we regard a view. So the view is the UI. It is the presentation of your design, your page, your form, your view. That is the purpose of the view. All right. And I'll do a little bit of a live demo on how this is structured in one of our designs. All right. But then you've got your controller, and your controller is, once again, in our case, we treat it as a Java class for each document type. So if we had a timesheet model, we would have a timesheet controller that looks after that model. And in our controllers, which is slightly different to probably how most people use it, but in our controllers, all logic for that controller type exists. So a lot of people would use a model, and inside that model not only define the properties, but go and create functions for saving and validating the data. What we decided to do is that the controller manages all logic, whether it be validating the content, saving the data, fetching data for the timesheet, or performing special functions like get all timesheets for user, or get unprocessed timesheets, or get overdue, whatever. All the logic would exist in one controller for that form type. All right. We also have controllers that look after the application as a whole. So you have, for example, we have a global controller, and this global controller exists as an application scoped object that looks after the application irrelevant of which user is accessing it. And what this controller does is it provides in-memory list objects that could be used by everyone. So let's say for whatever reason there was a 60 to 70% chance that any user accessing your application will want to know which clients to capture the timesheets for, instead of continuously grabbing that list of clients from the backend data store, we load it in our global controller in a list, in a variable, in an array list variable, and make it accessible to everyone so that there is no need to call the backend. It's just, there you go, return the result. So that's a good idea of what global controller does. It also helps us determine dependencies like databases, data stores that where we need to fetch data from. We can go and define those in the global controller so that we can make reference those variables when it comes to view data sources or other parts of your code. Great, it's a great feature, and it really eliminates unnecessary callbacks to the server per user, and rather have that scope globally available. We also then have a session controller. A session controller looks after the user session irrelevant of which XPage they're in for that application. It could be the case that your application might have more than one XPage for whatever reasons. We do it typically. We have a login XPage, and we have a primary XPage, and usually we separate the two so that when you are an anonymous user, you get automatically redirected to the login page, and there is just no way you can access the primary area of your application. So that's a typical example. But either way, we have a session controller that is looking after that user session, whether you are anonymous, whether you are logged in, whether you are on the login page, or whether you're on the main page. And it comes in very handy when it comes to the things like passing URL parameters between the pages and stuff like that. So for each document type, what I explained before, that's usually when we also have a controller object. And then finally, for each primary feature of your application, you might have reporting capability in your application. You might have integration points into your application that you surface as web services to whoever, the public, and then the user controller, which looks after the user credentials and all that kind of stuff. What we do in our case is we make sure that a controller exists for each one of those so that all the necessary logic can be stored and managed separately instead of all meshed together. It makes for a very clean environment, and I've seen how easy it is for the rest of the team to adopt this kind of approach. Before you know it, they're up and running, and they're no longer asking where is this and where is that, because the design elements are kind of telling them straight off the bat what's going on. So a really, really great approach to our strategy and what we aim to achieve, and it's really worked well for our team and for the past couple of projects. This is just a quick example of the faces config file based on the previous slides. So you'll see over there I've got a managed bean called globals, which is the global controller, and I store it as an application scope. I've then got the user session, which is the session controller. I store it as the session scope. I've then got app, which is an app controller, and the app controller looks after the more sort of low-end form type controllers, and what it does is if you have a timesheet controller and you have a purchase order controller and you have this controller, instead of going and defining all of them inside your faces config, I rather just define an app controller and expose those other controllers through it. So it takes a little while to get your head around it, but I have promised Mr. David Leedy some further tutorials on Note C9 in the near future, and I will be explaining this concept in more detail. So you can see over here, I've also have file attachment controllers that manages the uploading and downloading and replacing of attachments and images. I've got a utilities controller, and I've got the reports controller, which looks after report logic. So that's usually what my faces config looks like. I think this is as complicated as what it would get. Most of them are a lot less involved. All right. So back to a demonstration. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the design, and please excuse me, I have to log into my virtual machine. All right. There we go. All right, so you can see inside the design, I've got the Optimus XPages Portal 1, and you can see on top of here, portal data. So why do I do that? Remember in the beginning when I said that one of the considerations to be cloud ready is to separate your design from your data store. So that's the data store for this XPages application. And you can see over here that I've got one view, and the reason why I have that view is because in a notes storage or in a notes database design element, the one element that must exist is at least a view. So that's why that's there. But you can see over here, I have no forms. And if you go to XPages, I have one XPage called locations, and that's it. Everything else exists as custom controls. All right. So you can see I prefix many of the custom control design elements with CC0, and those usually form part of the core design elements that look after the overall logic of the application. When it comes to more specific design elements, like for example in this case, which is the locations application, what we do is we have design elements that relate to that feature. Locations form data, locations form data map. And if I go into one of these, and if I just expand this and go to the source, you'll see that the design itself is relatively clean. I've got very little JavaScript running inside the design, and most of them are just evaluating true or false or performing server-side Java calls. So this app over here is from the faces config. That is my application controller, which is a Java class. So I'm calling Java methods straight from the XPages design. I don't even bypass server-side JavaScript in this case. And if I just travel down, I just want to prove a small point that the actual XPages source code, I trust you agree with me, is relatively clean because all the logic just exists elsewhere in a place where it needs to be. All right. If we go down to our script libraries, you'll see that I only have one server-side script library, and that was meant for some sort of validation thing. I'm not even sure I'm using that anymore. But that is the only piece of server-side JavaScript other than what I have inside the XPage that exists inside this application. The rest is either client-side JavaScript, which is very powerful and works great with single-page application development thanks to remote services, or it's Java code that exists inside the Java area over there. So if I go down to Java, you can see this is an example of all my controllers. So I've got background processes, which I'll get to shortly. That's got to do with the OpenNTF Domino API. There's my utilities class that allows me to do generic things like set up a brand new document object with all the necessary readers and authors fields and everything that I know for a fact we want our document designs to have. I've then got the location controller and the location model, and this is what I mentioned earlier on. So this particular application is location-based, or it's capturing of location. So here's the model. If I go inside here, you can see I've got the location name, the type. I've got the physical address, postal address. Yes, I need to replace these vectors with ArrayList because it is preferred. I now know that, and I will do it soon enough. But here's my constructor that goes and sets the default values for these properties, and there's my getters and setters. All right, that's all my model has. And our models never get more complicated than this. It is our controller that has all the logic. So you can see over here in our controller that we have an object that represents a new location and an object that represents an existing location. And we've got the necessary code that goes and creates a new object, creates a new document, cancels the document, saves the document, opens an existing document, toggles document between read and edit mode, and a couple of other functions like duplication checks, get location views, and a series of additional things. And this is a great example of how one controller object contains all the necessary logic related to that controller, and it just works brilliantly. So application controller looks after the application. It looks after headed database titles and defaults that relate to the application design. And what it also does is it surfaces the location controller through this. That is why earlier on I said that in the faces config, I need only reference the app controller, because through the app controller, I will gain access to the rest of my form type controllers. All right, so I hope this has given a little bit of a visual example of how I use controllers. There's just another one. There's my web service controller, which is meant to be an API controller, and there's my global controller and my session and user controller. So everything is very standard, and this is the common practice across all our designs. All right, back to the presentation. I'm starting to get used to my voice. All right, so let's continue with application architecture. So let's take a look at the extension library, and I'm really hoping that by now most people somehow use the extension library. I know there's a lot of problems when it comes to production environments. You need to have an officially supported version of whatever plugins or that you want to place on the production server. I fully understand that, but assuming that that wasn't the problem, I would highly recommend using the latest extension libraries that are available on openntf.org. And the reason for that is because not too long ago, excuse me, in fact, a few months ago, in fact, a release, sorry everyone, I seem to be burping uncontrollably, my bad. A few months ago, they released a version of the XPages extension library that included some crazy enhancements, and one of them was the inclusion of Twitter Bootstrap and jQuery. And this meant that by switching this on as a theme, sorry, I missed my thought over there for a second. By switching this on as a theme, most XPages controls, like list controls and text boxes and whatever you can think of, become automatically Bootstrap enabled and responsive. Now that's a magic feature, because prior to that, one had to manually include a responsive framework and manually style every control. It was a nightmare. So having this feature available has been a blessing. And in terms of rapid application development, you really need to try out the application layout when you've got Twitter Bootstrap and everything enabled, and go and take one of your existing application layouts and switch on this Twitter Bootstrap and see what it does. It is really magic how everything just becomes mobile friendly and responsive, requiring very little polishing. There's really not a lot of effort, especially if you are a designer. You can, you'll probably spend a bit of time just tweaking and polishing a few things, but the majority of the work has been done by the XPages runtime team, and I really got to thank the guys. They've done an outstanding job. So yeah, I really highly recommend the XPages extension library now more than ever. Yeah. Then we've got XAgent. So I kept on speaking earlier on about integration points into your application, where you allow secure read and write of data and features and functionality, and you do this via XAgents. All right, so an XAgent is an XPage that does not render a user interface but executes logic and returns data as a result. So an XAgent will be accessed the way you would normally access an XPage, via a URL. And you can add optional parameters, or you can just reference the URL directly. It doesn't really matter. What matters is the fact that it doesn't return actual UI. It returns whatever your logic wants it to return. So it's really powerful. So it exposes your XPages applications through APIs, and it becomes especially important when you want to provide some web services to native mobile applications that require data from your XPages applications. XAgents are a great way to achieve this. And then you've also got third-party platforms and applications. At the beginning, again, as part of the cloud-ready strategy, you want integration points, and it's not only you don't only want to make use of other services that are on the cloud that you're on, but you might want those services to access your applications through APIs, and XAgents is once again the way to do this. Very importantly though, scheduled agents. I don't think I can stress this enough, because many of us still require scheduled tasks and scheduled code to run. Now, I don't know if any of you have come across this problem, or if you've even considered this as an issue, but if all your logic lands up existing in Java classes the way I've explained earlier on, what happens when you now want to run a scheduled agent that should interact with that very code, or that should execute that very code that you created in your Java classes? The problem is they don't exist. They don't exist for your scheduled agent. So what I've seen most people, they go and either they either go back to the drawing board and go and write a load of script code and make their peace with the world, or they write Java code in any event, except that they have to rewrite the code, rewrite the logic that exists in your Java classes as managed beans. But thanks to XAgents, you can run scheduled Java agents that actually execute XPages logic, your Java managed beans logic, through an XAgent. And it's here where I need to just say special thanks to Mr. Per Lauston, because he's the one that helped me get this right on my site. So Mr. Per, thank you very much for that, and it's changed my world. All right, so if we just take a look at an XPages design, and this is a physical XPages design, you can see on top over here, the XP view has got a view state of no state and a rendered of false. And you'll see that after the render response, you are executing a function. And it could be a Java function or could be a server-side JavaScript function. It doesn't really matter. But that is all your XPage will consist of in order to turn it into an XAgent. Okay? And here is an example of a scheduled Java agent executing an XAgent. So you can see over here, we've got the session, we get the agent context, we get the DB path, and we create a URL that starts with localhost. Because it's the scheduled agent runs locally, you don't need to define a special host name. You can just specify localhost and then point it to the X page that you want to trigger. And it's as easy as doing connection.connect, and that's it. Your scheduled agent will go and execute your X agent, which will link to your managed bean code and all your Java classes. So it is a perfect world after all. All right. So now we come up to user experience. How much time do I have? Sorry, everyone. Okay. So user experience, we spoke about how the extension library has Twitter Bootstrap as part of the Twitter Bootstrap framework as part of the extension library. Okay. So for those, just in case there's those who still not yet know what Twitter Bootstrap is, it is a web framework for developing responsive, mobile-friendly applications. All right, so the Twitter Bootstrap has collected a library of style sheets and JavaScript, and it makes use of jQuery, and together they've done a lot of the heavy work when it comes to being responsive, creating responsive, good-looking designs. They've done a lot of the heavy work that you don't have to manually do yourself, and thanks to it being included in the extension library, the XPages runtime team have made sure that their controls are in fact responsive and include Twitter Bootstrap features. So, like I said, it's got intelligent styling that readjusts web pages based on the device's form factors. Very modern UI controls, and we're all, for those who do know Twitter Bootstrap, we're all very excited as version 4 is underway. And thanks once again to the XPages runtime team, they already have a alpha version of the extension library called EXTLibX or whatever. It was in their previous webinar, where they are now testing out version 4 of Twitter Bootstrap already. So it's exciting times. All right, Twitter Bootstrap is really one of the most popular frameworks. There are many others out there, Kendo, Foundation, and a number of others, but Twitter Bootstrap has really done a great job, and it's one that one can easily back. A developer can easily back this. It's a good way to go. Then you've got third-party libraries that can just do the world of difference when creating a much better user experience for the users when working in your application. One of them is animate.css, and if one look carefully, I demonstrated this in the 2 applications that I showed off earlier on. And what it does is it just provides animations to your blocks and your sections of your web page, whether it be fade-ins, whether it be bouncing, whether it be move out left or move in right, or whatever the case may be. Animate is a great library just to add a little bit more boom to your XPages application. Then you've got Toaster, which provides non-blocking notifications, and if anyone was watching my task demo of my task app, you'll notice that whenever I created a new task, it presented a pop-up on the top right of the screen, and I'll show this now again shortly. It's really a great feature, and there's so many things that you can do with it as well. Some great functionality over there, and it works brilliantly with an XPages environment. You've then got Font Awesome, Font Awesome, very similar to glyph icons from the Twitter Bootstrap library, except on steroids. So they offer also a collection of glyph icons or icons of various categories, yet they provide additional features like stacking and grouping, resizing, and animating of these icons, and I'll give an example of that shortly as well. Finally, you've got Suite Alert, which provides animated alert notifications, some really cool stuff. For me, I don't like the standard alert dialog or the alert box from JavaScript. I want to slip my wrists every time I see one of those. But at the same time, I like even less having to go and create Bootstrap model dialogues just so that I can present a decent pop-up. So Suite Alert really gives you some quick, easy functionality that just makes a world of difference. And let me go and quickly show off this functionality. Excuse the login screen over here. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to reload this page, and when I do, take a note of this widget over here and how it fades in left when the page loads. All right, that is an example. I don't know how well this worked. Sorry, I don't know how well this worked on everyone's side, the fact that this is an online webinar, but what it does is it actually fades in left. And if we go to this over here, you'll see that the list box and the task inbox, when I reload the page, it fades in up. All right, so those are just two examples of how I'm using the Animate library to provide just a little bit more flair to our applications. If we take a look at the toaster notifications, so this should show up on the top right side. Enter. There we go. That is an example of a toaster notification. And what's great is while it's there, I can still work within the environment. It doesn't block the application. So it's really a great library to include. And it comes with a series of features. I mean, we can even go mad and it will stack the notifications in the event that there are more than one. So really some really powerful stuff over there. If we go to and try and we edit this document over here. I'm sorry if I'm moving fast for everyone. I should probably get slapped if I am, because then you're not really seeing the demo. So what I've done is I've opened up a document and I've put it into edit mode. And a rule that we have in this application is that you cannot have two editable documents of the same type at the same time. It's just a standard rule that we put in place. Don't ask why. It's just one of those things. So in the event that you have a location in edit mode and you go and try and create a new location, you get a nice animated dialog that says, whoops, you have a document in edit mode, please revise. And for those who didn't see that coming, I'm going to go 3, 2, 1, boom. And you can see very friendly, very nice. Now to generate that was one line of code. And that's thanks to the Suite Alert library. All right, and this thing comes in various flavors as well. If I just go back to the task application, if we take a look at these icons on the left-hand side over here, as well as the icons over here, these are examples of font icons being used inside the application. You'll notice that these are slightly bigger than these ones over here, and that is because we have the ability to upsize icons using the font icon library, and the circle with the calendar inside is in fact two icons that are being stacked together to give you this kind of styling. And of course, you can overwrite the colors of the icons as well. So some very, very funky features over here. If I just quickly go to this page, you can see that I've got some. This is the font awesome page, and you can see the sizing as well as the animating of icons and rotation and stacking of icons. If we go to Suite Alert, it takes you to demos. This is a typical dialog, and this is a new dialog, and you've obviously got some nice alternative versions of Suite Alert where it can contain text and a series of additional things. Yes, Toaster, great online dashboard, allows you to manipulate a series of properties that can change how the Toaster notification is loaded. Some very cool stuff over here. And animate.css, where you can go and do flashing and test out various styles of animation that you can use for your controls. All right, and I do have links to all of these inside the presentation. All right, so I think I'm still okay for now. I've got about probably 10 minutes left if I'm not mistaken. So we're at our final section of this presentation, which is optimization. And I want to start this section off by adding another great quote where a developer achieves perfection not when there is nothing more to add, but when there is nothing more to take away. And just a quick backstory to that is probably one of the best development days I had was when I grabbed an application that was developed many years ago and I decided to uplift it and upgrade it a little bit. I landed up removing almost 2,000 lines of logic and yet having it achieve the same without affecting any functionality. And it was really one of the best development days that I had. And yes, of course, everyone had to start somewhere, so I'm not too hard on myself that I had to spend that day doing that. But I love the idea of I'm not happy, and one shouldn't be happy until there is nothing more to take away. I think it's a fantastic quote, and I think it should stick to any developer out there. So one of the last things that I want to speak about is the multi-threaded operations. Now, this comes with the OpenNTF Domino API and powered by ZOTS or XPages, DOTS, or whatever the case may be. At IBM Connect, I couldn't even say this properly on stage, so I'm glad I got it right now. What this does is it executes your logic in its own thread so that the user doesn't depend or does not have to wait for that logic to finish. So another example is asynchronous operations in Java code. If you have to think about a user submitting a purchase order, and when they submit that purchase order, once validated, it goes through a series of operations, right? It gets saved, it gets written to the back end. Let's say that emails need to be sent out. Let's say that notifications need to be sent out to mobile devices via web services. Other back-end documents need to be updated, all right? Your logic could contain all of these operations, but how many of those operations does the user need to wait for so that they can gain access to the application they've been working on? And the chances are that quite a bit of the logic that runs, the user doesn't necessarily need to wait for that. And so multi-threaded operations really gives us the ability to place that logic in a separate thread so that it can do what it needs to do in the back end without the user having to wait for anything to run finished. And this kind of method really works great, especially when it comes to mobile apps, because the last thing you want is a mobile app to run a web service that is performing all kinds of logic that the mobile app doesn't even care about at the end of the day, but it has to sit there and wait for everything to finish so that it can return a result so that the mobile app can continue. So I really highly recommend multi-threaded operations. It's a little bit tricky when you're starting with it. Mr. Paul Withers has got some great tutorials on how to make use of this capability, but I'm also going to be spending a bit of time on tutorials, and this is part of my package of tutorials to David Leedy as soon as I'm back from the Netherlands. All right. So the other, I'll give a quick example of this if I do have time. I'm doing my best to make time over here. All right. The other one is switch and dynamic content controls. Now, this is probably one of the most important design elements from the extension library. And what this does is it allows us to divide the application or the web page into HTML blocks that are only rendered when relevant, and if not relevant, are removed from the HTML output. And this means that the only HTML that exists on the web page is the HTML that is required, which is brilliant, because if you take a look at jQuery and Dojo and the kind of operations that they need to perform, the less HTML your page has, the faster the jQuery and Dojo will run, because they have less to loop through. If you ever do a jQuery, find me this ID and find the class within that ID and populate the value. If you think it just goes straight to that, that's not the case. It has to loop through, it has to work through your HTML documents so that it can evaluate true. So the less HTML you have, the better. And switch and dynamic controls help you achieve this and are the core magic to implementing single-page application designs. All right. So you have a lightweight HTML page. You have hidden HTML is not even rendered. It's kept in either in memory, the XML tree, depending on which item you use. And I need to say this, a big thanks to Mr. Paul Withers for helping me understand the core differences between the switch and dynamic content control. The one helps you maintain a state. The switch control helps you maintain the state of whatever was presented and removed, whereas the dynamic content control keeps on reloading the HTML output as if it was brand new. So those are sort of the core differences between the two, but either work brilliantly. All right. So our last demonstration, all I want to do is I just want to give you an example of how easy it is to implement a background multi-threaded operation. So what I do over here is I've got a Java class called background processes, and inside it you can see that I'm using the zots.tasklet, and I'm doing a session clone. A lot of this stuff is very sort of generic. Excuse me. And I have a public class here called background processes, which implements runnable. Again, a lot of this stuff, if you follow my approach, you don't even really need to know a lot of this stuff. What matters is whenever you want to run a multi-threaded operation, you need to call this, you need to import this library, call this method, and pass two parameters as I've done here. The first parameter is the type of operation you are performing. So you might be wanting to send notifications out to this person, okay? So that would be process type number 1. Or you might want to be send out mobile notifications. That would be process type number 2. The second parameter is your JSON data. So what happens is I usually pass parameters as JSON objects. I don't pass them as individual parameters as part of the method. It is just my approach. It's my way of doing it. It comes from developing mobile applications. And one of the great reasons for doing that here is because we can still use the same Java class, and we don't have to care about how many properties need to be passed because they are in fact stored in a JSON object. So it doesn't really matter. We can have our code look after that part. This can now remain generic and be used in multiple controllers. So based on the process type, we can go and execute the necessary logic, and whatever executes over here happens in its own thread, and there is no dependency on this. So this is an example of the actual background process class. If we go to my global controller, I have a little snippet of code here called test background process. You can see there I'm defining my JSON data object. I'm keeping it null for now. And it's as easy as saying zots.getService.submit, and you pass that background process Java class that I showed you earlier on, passing the type of process you're running and the data that you are sending to it. And this line of code will run in its own thread, and the rest of your method can run without being blocked. And that is a great example of how to use background multi-threaded operations. It's really as easy as that. You've just got to get your head around the idea of calling that Java class, and it's really, really works wonders. All right. So we have come to the end of this webinar / presentation. I've got 2 minutes left, so just some resources for everyone. You can see over here we've got xpages.info, openntf.org, the XPages knowledge base. You've seen a lot of hype around this recently. And I just want to say special thanks to Frederick Norling, Paul Withers, Frank van der Linden, and even Brian Gleason. Thank you for already contributing to the XPages knowledge base. It's only really been over a month, and we've already got a number of articles over there. Thank you guys so much, and I can't wait to see the next line of contribution to this. It's really going to be a great value add to the community. And then you've just got some resources to Animate Toaster and Sweet Alert. So in the words of David Leedy, I thank you for your time, and here is my contact information, and I will leave the page over here while Mr. Howard and Paul will probably throw me a series of questions.
Hey, John, that was great. Yes, we're going to throw you some questions, but first, let me review again how people can ask questions. So again, you can ask questions in the GoToWebinar interface. So on the slide you're hopefully seeing now, there's a questions pane. if you're not seeing the GoToWebinar interface, you might just see the little ribbon bar. You click the little orange arrow, and then you'll see the questions pane that you can expand and ask a question. And we'll get to the questions in one moment. Just wanted to point out some upcoming events that are coming up between now and the summer. Engage conference, as John mentioned, he's headed there, as well as a number of other folks, which is next week, I believe, in the Netherlands. And Theo, I think, said that they are pretty much full, but you can still register, and they'll make room for as many people as they can. Then there's some other events in Germany. A new event that has hit the radar screen is a virtual event, which is great because you don't have to travel, and in these days of budgets, that can be useful. It's on May 9th and 10th, and it's the ICON US virtual user group. This is Chris Miller has a couple years ago had a actual event in St. Louis, so this is kind of a takeoff of that event, but virtual. So you can go over to the website and check that out. They're just in the initial stages of registration. So Paul, do you have some questions lined up for John?
Yes, we do. I've got a question from Mark. Must the X agent run as a web user? I have an app where I need access, or ACL access to the web application. So, and the user has anonymous access. So, does it have to run as just the web user, or can you run it as, with designer privileges as well?
This is the XPage. So all of my X agents run as anonymous off the bat, right? So they never get triggered as an authenticated user. So what is important is that there is at least some sort of default access, whether it be reader as an example, to the XPages the design element or the XPages application that you want to run. But the usual idea is that it gets triggered as anonymous, and then using header parameters or URL parameters, you can define the context in which this agent is trying to run as. I usually pass all of that information as a JSON parameters via the header.
Okay, well, let's see, John, here's another question about Java. You're obviously using a lot of Java in your apps, and Jen commented that the build times become very long when she adds a lot of Java in her application. Do you have any suggestions about improving that, or any other recommendations?
Times.
Yeah, and she said both automatic and manual.
Yes, because what happens is I use both. Where if I'm only working in an application on my own, then I have no quarrel switching on build automatically. But I must say that I haven't been faced with lengthy times that it takes in order for the design element to build properly. I even clean my design, my database design often, and even that is quite quick. So the one thing that you might check is inside the XSP properties. I think there is on the first or second tab a property setting that says evaluate entire design on build or refresh. Now, as a default, I have that switched off because I've just never seen the need to use it. But it might be that if that is switched on, it's performing a series of additional heavy lifting on the design element. That is in honesty, that is as much as what I know about that. But it is strange. I don't have that happening on mine or my team side.
John, do you run you develop your applications locally and then replicate them up to a server, or are you working in Designer on a server-based application?
Myself and my team, we have our local Domino servers that we run on our local machines, and we do all of our development over there. We also then use SourceTree and Bitbucket for source control, and we manage team development via those means. But every one of us runs a local Domino server in order to perform all the necessary development. We don't rely on the preview in web browser and the local HTTP task. It just doesn't work for us. We need a Domino server because we really do some additional things that the local HTTP task cannot give us.
Okay, so I think that might be, I don't know, Jen who asked the question, if she's working on a server copy, possibly if a slow connection, you might want to try working locally and then replicating the changes up to the server for testing. That might be a suggestion too.
True.
Go ahead, Paul.
Okay, I've got a question from Sam. The Bootstrap libraries, are they part of Notes and Domino release 901, the latest release, or is it the extension library that comes with 901, or do I have to get the OpenNTF extension library to take advantage of that? You see,
yes, good question, and I'm not too sure what's happening with Fixpack 5, and I don't even think that matters. The answer is, as I know it right now, it's part of the OpenNTF XPages extension library, and it is a recent release. I think it got released in November, so it definitely didn't come with any kind of major release. I just don't know if it was going to be incorporated into any of the minor releases or Fixpacks. I haven't heard anything on that. So as I understand it, it's part of the new OpenNTF XPages extension library. And more importantly, the very latest XPages extension library has got the latest version of Twitter Bootstrap, 3.3.6, if I'm not mistaken, which is a massive advancement from the original 3.2.0 that most people know about. So it's very important to have that extension library that contains that version of Bootstrap. Many bug fixes and enhancements got included in that.
And yes, I guess the plan, IBM's plan, is that whatever Notes and Domino next is, which is sometime this year, that will incorporate what's in the OpenNTF extension library, and therefore Bootstrap. But
yes.
But it's currently not in the official, if you want to call it, the IBM supplied extension library. John, I got a question from Tony. So when you use separate databases for design and development, your views still have to exist in the database that has the data. How do you manage this from a source control development management point of view?
Well, all our data designs get included in all our database designs, whether it's the actual runtime or whether it's the data stores, they get included in our source control. So I do export those design elements, but obviously it's a very small design element, and it only really does contain views and the actual data. Obviously the data is not stored anywhere, but I treat it as if it's an actual design. And yeah, it's not easier than that. Not that the view design elements can be read in any other editor, you open them up and it's just a mesh of code. But yeah, I treat them the same way I treat my XPages applications when it comes to source control. I don't know, maybe I misunderstood the question.
No, I think that was it. It was just a question of how do you manage, I guess the design now is it's still in multiple databases, but you can't get away from the forms and views being with the data, obviously.
Well, yeah, except if you take my approach and you do away with forms, because in essence they're not really required if you're doing XPages only applications. Especially also if you're using managed beans and not document data sources, the requirement to actually have form designs, the requirement is just not there anymore. So you're down to just managing views inside the data stores.
Right, that's a good point.
Okay. First off, a clarification, and thank you, Brian Gleason from IBM, making the point, and it's in the question area, but he's making the point that Bootstrap 3 will be included with Notes and Domino next. So that's great news.
Nice.
Okay, so another question from Don. You said this quickly, but please repeat the difference between that switch control and that dynamic content control.
Okay. All right. So the two primary differences between these two controls is, number one, how you trigger the change. So when it comes to a switch control, it works very much like a JavaScript or Java switch statement. It works very much like a Lotus script select statement, except that the casings are define what content gets loaded onto the web page versus in code what code gets executed. So the switch uses a default facet property and a selected facet property, which is usually bound to a scoped variable that you define, and that on a partial refresh, if you change the value in that scoped variable, it will switch the content within the switch control based on the new value of the scoped variable. So it's a key value pair that happens over there. Whereas a dynamic content control, you change the content by triggering call statements to say, listen, this dot show, this dot hide, or whatever. So those are two of the different ways of executing or modifying the content within these controls. But coming to back what I mentioned is, let's say that you have a view and a document, and what happens is they exist as two entries in your switch control. And what happens is the view is open first, but when you click on a link, you change the scoped variable of the switch control so that it loads the document and it takes away the HTML content that represented the view. So now you've got the HTML content that represented the document. Okay. Now let's say you're done with that document and you go back to and you see it cancel so that it reloads the view in the first switch case. What happens is, however that view existed, however you changed it, whether you expanded or collapsed categories or went to page 2 or whatever, it maintains its state, because while the HTML is removed from the web page, the actual XPages element the content was kept in memory. So it just got reintroduced to the page. Whereas a dynamic content control does not keep the content that did exist in memory, which means that if you close the document, it reinitializes the view as if it was opened for the first time. It does not maintain the state of the view as it existed before. And both of these controls are there for the reason, and they both have their pros and cons, and it just all depends on how you use them. I hope that made sense.
Yeah, that's great, John. I guess I'll add to that is basically, in terms of keeping state, it's the component tree. In the switch control, loads everything into the component tree, and it's always there in memory, whereas the dynamic content is only loading into the component tree what the user is currently active, what's currently active. And also another, David Leedy brought up a good point, and this is actually, you had mentioned the application property or XSV property setting, refresh entire application when design changes. The reason that often is turned on with when you have a lot of Java beans is that you get this class exception error when you make a design change in one Java class and not in another, and the application's still loaded in the server, and it's the way to alleviate that error is turn that property on, so it basically reloads the whole application, all the beans and everything. I don't know if you've ever seen that, John. This is the fix.
Yeah, it's a great point. And my question is, let's say a user's busy working with that application. Am I right in saying that user will have to reload it, otherwise that XPage app breaks in some way? If they're currently using it, it just goes wonky.
Right. If you change the design while the user's using it, this kind of forces all the beans to get reloaded, I believe.
Okay, very good point.
So we had a question, another question actually, while we're picking on David Leedy. David wanted to know, when using Suite Alert, that you have confirmation buttons like the cancel OK. Since this is client-side JavaScript, what's the best way to get it back to the back-end processes like a page controller so the server could process it?
The best way that I do it is obviously each one of these controls have event listeners on the buttons and on the triggers, and those event listeners return a JSON object back to your client-side JavaScript, which you can then pass back to your server-side via remote services. And this really has just been the most efficient way of me being able to create a synergy between client-side capabilities like these suite alerts and jQuery and event listeners, and still have the server side run all the necessary logic. It's just the way that I do it. So remote services, which is part of the extension, I think it's part of 901. It existed already back then. So remote services and event listeners is how I play this game of managing these libraries.
Well, it sounds like, John, you and David Weedy got to get together and make that one of your notes and nines.
Yeah, no, for sure.
Well, we're kind of running out of time, but there's a number of folks, John, are asking about demo databases, and I know you and I talked about that and said that some of the stuff in your demo database you couldn't release, but I know you had plans to release some of this. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah. So what happened was I made certain commitments to certain Davids out there already at IBM Connect, and I think the long and short of it is that as soon as I'm back from Engage, which is next week, I will start sort of making a heavy plan on converting these sessions into more formalized video tutorials and providing the source code, the necessary source code along with it. And I think one of the very reasons why I haven't done this as yet is to also provide TLCC and Team Studio a little bit of exclusivity relating to this session. But as soon as I'm back from Engage, there's no doubt that I will start working on some great video content out there, and which will obviously be published and presented via Notes in 9.
Okay, that's great, John. And thanks, David Weedy, for providing that service. Well, I think we're kind of out of time. Paul, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, just wanted to thank John and everyone for attending today. I think this has been an awesome session.
Yes, John, this is great. We had a lot of questions, and it's obviously a lot of interest. So thanks so much for presenting. And Courtney, thank you for hosting the session today. And I hope everyone has a great day.
Yeah, thanks so much everyone again for attending, and thank you so much Paul, Howard, and Courtney.